Hello students, welcome to the series on business environment. The topic of this lecture is fiscal policy. The objective of this lecture is to discuss the meaning, definition, need and significance of fiscal policy. To begin with, let us discuss the various definitions of fiscal policy given by different authors. In the words of M.L. Jingan, fiscal policy means the use of taxation and public expenditure by the government for stabilization or growth, which means that the government collects tax from the public like the income tax, house tax, sales tax, entertainment tax, etc., and utilizes it as revenue to stabilize and increase the growth of economy of the nation. In the words of J.M. Culbertson, by fiscal policy we refer to government actions affecting its receipts and expenditures which we ordinarily take as measured by the government's receipt, its surplus or deficit, which means that the government collect revenue from the public, which is referred to the receipts or expenditure by the government. Sometimes the amount collected may be higher or lower than expected. On this, M.L. Jingan says that the government may offset the undesirable variations in private consumption and investment by compensatory variations of public expenditure and taxes. According to Arthur Smithies, fiscal policy is a policy under which the government uses its expenditure and revenue programs to produce desirable effects and avoid undesirable effects on the national income, production and employment, which means that the government does not neglect the short-term economic fluctuations. It rather put efforts to regulate and moderate the short-term economic fluctuations rather than just making long-term economic stability of the country as its main aim. Otto Extens defines fiscal policy as changes in taxes and expenditures which aim at short-run goals of full employment and price level stability, which means that changes in taxes and expenditure is done by the government to fulfill the short-term goals for employment and price level stability to ensure it in the long run. For the developed economies, the fiscal policy aims at economic stability, and for the developing countries, the fiscal policy aims at economic development. Through fiscal policy, government collects taxes as revenue and utilizes the same for the economic development of the nation and overcomes the problem of unemployment and price instability and problems related to the national income. Now let us discuss the need or significance of the fiscal policy. As highlighted by S.K. Mishra and V.K. Puri in their book Economics of Development and Planning, the importance of fiscal policy as an economic tool was recognized during the period of Great Depression of 1930s and as a consequence of writings of J.M. Keynes. Before this, it was assumed that the government had a negligible positive role to play in the economy and its activities should remain restricted to the maintenance of law and order and the provision of certain essential services to the economy. The classical dictum was that the government is the best that governs the least. During the Great Depression of 1930s, it became amply evident that if the private sector is left on its own, it could not initiate a process of recovery since the incentive to invest was simply not there. Therefore, the government had to step in. Keynes brought out the role of government interference more empathically when he established that there could be considerable unemployment even at the equilibrium level of the national income. And to resolve this problem of unemployment, interference by the government in one form or the other is must. Government has to step in during the situation of rapidly increasing prices and try to restrict the total volume of expenditure in the economy. Therefore, whether it is a situation of inflation or deflation, the situation of bringing back the economic stability has to be borne by the government. In developing countries like India, the need for fiscal policy was felt because of the general poverty of the masses and high marginal propensity to consume. Because of this, the ratio of savings to national income is very small in India. It is because of the low volume of savings that the rate of investment also remains low, and there is a grave problem of underemployment in our country. To avoid such situations, the government must direct its efforts to solving the twin problem of underemployment and inflation. According to Chelaya, the goal of fiscal policy in a developing country may be said to be the promotion of the highest possible rate of capital formation without inflation. We already know the meaning, definition of fiscal policy given by the various authors, and we also know the need of fiscal policy. Now we will continue this lecture with the discussion of objectives of the fiscal policy. The various objectives of fiscal policy are to maintain and achieve full employment, to stabilize price level, to stabilize the growth rate of the economy, to maintain equilibrium in the balance of payments, to promote the economic development of the underdeveloped countries, to increase the rate of investment, to encourage a socially optimum pattern of investment, to reduce inequality in income, to reduce unemployment and underemployment, to control inflationary tendencies and mobilization of resources. Let us discuss these objectives of fiscal policy in detail. In developing countries like India, the volume of income and employment are low. So, the main aim of the fiscal policy here in developing countries like India is to increase the rate of capital formation. To increase the rate of capital formation, incremental saving ratio should be increased and actual as well as potential consumption should be restricted. To increase the incremental saving ratio, the government income should be increased, and it can be increased through taxation or public borrowings. Income from taxes increase by increasing the rate of existing taxes or by imposing new taxes. For restricting actual and potential consumption, government exercises direct physical controls on the availability and the use of some consumption goods like the non-essential goods. The scope of imposing direct tax like the income tax in developing countries like India is limited because the level of income and employment are low here, and only a small group of people can pay the taxes. Therefore, the government imposes heavy taxes on the luxury goods as the demand of such goods is elastic, which means that when the price of the good increases, the demand of the good decreases. Hence, the government has to impose tax on goods which possess the inelastic demand. So, raising additional resources through taxation is difficult to be achieved. Government is not very successful in raising resources from public borrowings because of the problem of low income and low saving in developing countries like India. For investment purpose, the government may use surplus of public utilities and public enterprises like railways, port facilities, postal and telegraph system, irrigation works, etc. But this fails to cover the depreciation as well as the interest on capital. The public enterprises also suffer operating deficits, so the users of such services are subsidized at the expense of the taxpayers in developing countries like India. But it should be kept in mind that subsidies may often displace government expenditure and will ultimately contribute to the development of the economy. In the words of Richard Goody, there is a strong presumption in favor of prices that will cover full cost, including capital cost, and in many cases return a surplus to finance expansion of the enterprise. But the resources generated by taxation, public borrowings or public enterprises usually fall short of the requirement for investment, and hence the government has to aim at deficit financing or creation of money. The objective of fiscal policy is to encourage direct investment in the fields which are most favorable for the betterment of the society. India has potential for industrial development, and it must also undertake large scale investment in basic and capital goods industries. These industries must fall under the category of socially optimum investment because basic and capital goods industries form the basis of large-scale industrialization programs. Yet another objective of the fiscal policy is mobilization of resources. As mentioned earlier in this lecture, India is characterized by low level of income and investment, which are linked in a vicious circle. This vicious circle can be successfully broken by mobilization of resources for investment through fiscal policy. According to S.K. Mishra and V.K. Puri, in India about 1/3 of the population is below the poverty line, which is defined as a line just enough to ensure subsistence level, while some 20 to 25 large business houses exercise effective control on the industrial economy of the country. A welfare state committed to social equality and economic justice cannot allow such inequalities. So, the government used fiscal policy as an effective tool. The Government of India aims at designing the tax policy in such a manner that the whole tax structure becomes highly progressive. According to S.K. Mishra and V.K. Puri, the rich section of the population should be compelled to contribute substantially more in the form of taxes than the poorer sections in India. The lowest stratum of the society should not be taxed at all. The indirect taxes should be heavy on the luxury goods, as mentioned earlier in this lecture. The luxury goods here are referred to goods which are consumed only by the elite class. As far as public expenditure is concerned, the Indian government can undertake programs of medical care for poor, ensure free education to poor children, provide free housing sites to poor landless laborers, etc. Thus, by a judicious mixing of tax policies and public expenditure policies, The government of developing countries like India succeed in reducing the economic inequalities. But because of the problems of corruption, tax evasion and political conveniences of joining hands with the rich, it is frequently not possible to accomplish much in this direction. There are economic limits also on making the tax structure too progressive, as such a tax structure is likely to affect adversely the availability and willingness of the private sector to invest. Another objective of the fiscal policy is to eradicate the problem of underemployment or unemployment in India. To eradicate the problem of underemployment or unemployment in India, public expenditure programs have been given much significance. For example, large number of rural people remain unemployed or underemployed during off season, that is, when there is no work on land or on farm. A public works program of constructing school buildings, hospital buildings, roads, earthen dams, irrigation canals, etc. can be undertaken by the government during this off season to provide employment to such persons. The Government of India adopted the Rural Works Program or RWP in the third plan. This was followed by similar programs like Crash Scheme for Rural Employment, Employment Guarantee Scheme, Pilot Intensive Rural Employment Project, Food for Work Program, National Rural Employment Program or NREP, Jawahar Rozgar Yojana or JRY, Employment Assurance Scheme or EAS, Jawahar Gram Samriddhi Yojana or JGSY, Swarn Jayanti Gram Swarojgar Yojana or SGSY, Swarn Jayanti Shahri Rozgar Yojana or SJSRY, etc. The objectives of these programs have been to generate additional gainful employment for the unemployed and underemployed persons in the rural areas of India, and to create productive community assets for direct and continuing benefits to the poverty groups in India, and for strengthening the rural economic and social infrastructure, to bring about a general improvement in the overall quality of life in the rural areas in India, and most importantly, to provide wage employment to the rural poor in India. As highlighted by S.K. Mishra and V.K. Puri, because of the need to implement large-scale industrialization program, in the face of paucity of resources, the developing countries are often led to depend more and more on the deficit financing. This results in creation of inflationary situation because the supply of goods fail to increase sufficiently to nullify the increase in demand. So it becomes necessary to implement fiscal policy to control the level of demand and encourage the production of goods. The level of demand can be reduced by raising the level of taxation. For increasing the supply of goods, tax incentives to industries can be granted, and if necessary, protection to essential consumer goods industries can be provided by the Indian government. In this lecture, we have discussed the meaning of fiscal policy and the various definitions of fiscal policy given by the different authors. We also discussed the objectives, need and significance of fiscal policy in this lecture. Besides the advantages of the fiscal policy, there are some of the disadvantages of the fiscal policy too. Now let us talk about the limitations of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is successful in developed economies but only partially successful in developing economies like India. The main reason for this is that the tax structure in the developing countries like India is rigid and narrow. This is the reason for fiscal policy not being so successful in India. Thus, conditions conducive to the growth of well-knit and integrated tax policy is absent in such countries like India. So, the developing countries like India should have flexible taxation policies. Some of the limitations of the fiscal policy in developing countries like India are: a sizable portion of most developing countries like India is non-monetized, rendering fiscal measures of the government ineffective and self-defeating. These measures should be more flexible and effective to ensure the effectiveness of the government in maintaining the balance of income and savings by the citizens of India. Yet another limitation of the fiscal policy in India is lack of statistical information as regards the income, expenditure, savings, investment, employment, etc. This makes it difficult for the public authorities to formulate a rational and effective fiscal policy. For this, computer literacy is a must. The Government of India should encourage literacy and technical education in India so that the most updated data regarding income, expenditure, savings, investment, employment, etc. of the citizens of India can be made available for research, and thus the government can implement the most effective fiscal policy on the basis of the latest and most accurate data available. For this, more and more surveys should be undertaken. The next limitation of fiscal policy in India is fiscal policy cannot succeed unless people understand its implication and cooperate with the Government of India in its implication. This is due to the fact that in developing countries like India, a majority of people are illiterate. Again, to overcome this problem, the citizens of India must be educated, and government should encourage free educational programs in the rural and semi-urban areas in India to ensure higher level of education. If the citizens of India will be educated, then only they will understand the developmental measures taken by the Government of India and will eventually support the Government of India in successfully achieving these measures. The other limitation of fiscal policy in India is large-scale tax evasion by the people who are not conscious of their roles in development of the Indian economy and has an impact on the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy is adversely affected because of tax evasion. There should be strict laws relating to income tax. The taxpayers should be encouraged, and there should be punishment for the persons who escape paying taxes. The government should encourage easy and simple procedure and assess the people for payment of taxes. Another limitation of fiscal policy in India is that fiscal policy requires efficient administrative machinery to be successful. Most developing economies like India have corrupt and ineffective administration. that fails to implement the requisite measures to implement the fiscal policy. But the advantages of the fiscal policy are more than the limitations of the fiscal policy, as the fiscal policy aims at reducing unemployment and underemployment to ensure balance between the national income and savings of the individuals of India. And thus it ensures the economic development of India. To ensure the effectiveness and efficiency of the fiscal policy in India, the support of Indians is must. The Government of India, in order to ensure the support of people, must make them educated and well aware about the measures of the fiscal policy. Once the people understand what fiscal policy is and how it can help in raising their standard of living, then only the problem of tax evasion will be resolved and public will support the government with the fiscal policy. Every Indian should understand his or her role in contributing to the development of the Indian economy. The Indian citizens can do so by paying the taxes on time and by not getting involved in tax evasion. The Indians should be aware of the fact that by paying the taxes, they are contributing not only to the economy of India, but are also helping the poor and needy people in India. If they do so, the government will take more developmental work and there will be more employment and educational facilities to the rural poor, and thus the Indian economy will flourish. In this lecture, we have discussed the meaning, definition, need, objectives and significance of fiscal policy. In the next lecture, we will discuss the compensatory fiscal policy and taxation as a tool for public revenue. Thank you.